A social worker called me at work asking, "Can you explain why your daughter has bruises that match your hand size?" The words came through my desk phone at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports for the engineering firm where I worked as a project manager. The woman identified herself as Lenora Vance from Child Protective Services, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone trained to remain calm while delivering devastating news. My daughter Iris was 8 years old, and the light of my entire world. The suggestion that I'd hurt her made my vision tunnel, and my hands go numb. I asked what she was talking about, where Iris was, whether she was okay. Lenora said Iris was at Riverside Elementary with the school nurse, and that bruising had been discovered on her upper arms during a routine health screening. The bruises were consistent with someone gripping her forcefully, and when measured, they matched the span and size of an adult male hand. My hand, presumably, since I was her father and primary caregiver. I told Lenora there had to be some mistake, that I would never hurt Iris, that she must have gotten the bruises somewhere else. Lenora said she understood this was difficult, but they had to investigate all reports of potential abuse. She asked if I could come to the school immediately for an interview. Her tone made it clear this wasn't optional. I grabbed my keys and told my supervisor I had a family emergency, then drove to Riverside Elementary with my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced through every interaction I'd had with Iris over the past week, searching for any moment that could have left bruises. Couldn't think of anything. We'd been to the park on Saturday where she'd played on the swings. We'd made pancakes together Sunday morning. Monday through Wednesday had been normal school days with homework and dinner and bedtime stories. No falls, no accidents, no moments where I'd even raised my voice, much less grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The school's main office felt smaller than usual when I walked in. The secretary gave me a tight-lipped look and pointed toward a conference room where Lenora Vance waited along with Principal Gutierrez and a police officer named Ramos. Lenora was in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that assessed me clinically as I entered. Officer Ramos stood near the door with his arms crossed, his presence making it clear this was now a criminal matter as well as a child welfare investigation. Principal Gutierrez, who'd always been friendly during parent-teacher conferences, now looked at me with something between pity and suspicion. Lenora asked me to sit, and I did, my legs feeling unsteady. She explained that during the health screening conducted by the school nurse, Iris had been asked to change into a gown for a basic physical assessment. That's when the nurse noticed distinct bruising on Iris's upper arms, 4 marks on her left arm and 5 on her right, positioned exactly where fingers would grip if someone grabbed a child forcefully from the front. The nurse had photographed the bruises and measured them, then reported the findings to administration as required by state law. I asked to see Iris, and Lenora said that wouldn't be possible right now. They needed to complete their initial investigation first, and Iris was being interviewed separately by a forensic specialist trained in talking to children about potential abuse. The word abuse made me flinch like I'd been slapped. I told them again that I hadn't grabbed Iris, hadn't hurt her in any way. Officer Ramos asked where I'd been over the past week. I recounted our weekend activities and weeknight routine, emphasizing how normal everything had been. He asked if anyone could verify my whereabouts during times when the bruises could have occurred. I said no. It had mostly been just Iris and me at home since my wife Vanessa had died 2 years ago in a car accident. Officer Ramos exchanged a glance with Lenora that I didn't like. Lenora asked about my relationship with Iris. I explained that we'd been adjusting to life without Vanessa, that it had been hard on both of us, but we'd found our rhythm. Iris was doing well in school, had friends, seemed happy most of the time. Yes, there were moments when she got sad about missing her mom, and yes, sometimes she acted out or got frustrated, but that was normal grief for a child her age. Lenora asked how I handled it when Iris acted out. I said I used timeouts and took away privileges like screen time, that I'd never believed in physical punishment. My own father had used his belt on me growing up, and I'd promised myself I'd never do that to my child. Lenora wrote everything down in a notebook, her pen moving across the page with efficient strokes that felt like she was documenting my guilt rather than my innocence. She asked if Iris had ever come home from school or a friend's house with unexplained injuries before. I said no, nothing beyond normal kid stuff like scraped knees from playing. She asked if there was anyone else who had regular contact with Iris, anyone who might have caused the bruising. I mentioned that my mother watched Iris occasionally when I had late meetings at work, and that Iris had play dates with her best friend May Lynn at May Lynn's house sometimes. Lenora made notes about both. Officer Ramos asked if I'd consent to having my hands photographed and measured for comparison to the bruise pattern. I said yes immediately, eager to prove that whatever had happened, it hadn't been me. He pulled out a camera and took photos of my hands from multiple angles, then used a measuring tape to record the span from thumb to pinky when my hand was fully extended. The measurements took less than 5 minutes, but felt like hours. Lenora said they'd need to place Iris in protective custody until the investigation was complete. The words hit me like a physical blow. I asked how long that would take, and she said typically 72 hours for an initial assessment, though it could be extended if they found evidence of ongoing danger. I asked where Iris would stay, and Lenora said they had emergency foster placements for situations like this. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor and said there was absolutely no way my daughter was going to a stranger's house, that she'd be terrified, that she needed to be with family. Lenora said she understood my concern, but the safety of the child had to come first. If my mother was available and willing to undergo an emergency background check, they might be able to place Iris there instead. I called my mother immediately. She answered on the second ring, and I tried to explain what was happening without completely falling apart. She was confused at first, asking questions I couldn't answer, but when she understood that they wanted to take Iris away, she said of course she'd take her, that she'd do whatever they needed. Lenora spoke to my mother directly to arrange the placement and background check. Officer Ramos asked if I had any history of domestic violence or prior CPS involvement. I said no to both, my voice getting louder with frustration. He asked if Vanessa had ever filed any complaints about my parenting before she died. The question felt like an accusation about my dead wife, and I had to clench my fists under the table to keep from shouting. I said Vanessa had never complained because there was nothing to complain about. We'd been a happy family. We'd loved our daughter. We'd been good parents together. Principal Gutierrez finally spoke up and said that in her experience at the school, I'd always been engaged and supportive. She'd never seen any red flags in my interactions with Iris or heard anything concerning from Iris's teachers. Lenora thanked her for the input, but said they had to follow protocol regardless of subjective impressions. The forensic interview with Iris concluded, and a woman in her 30s entered the conference room carrying a folder. She introduced herself as Dr. Alicia Reyes, the child psychologist who'd spoken with Iris. Dr. Reyes sat down and opened the folder, pulling out a transcript of the interview. She said Iris had been cooperative but seemed confused about why she was being asked certain questions. When asked about the bruises, Iris initially said she didn't know how she got them. When pressed about whether anyone had grabbed her or hurt her, Iris said no. When shown drawings of different scenarios and asked if any looked familiar, Iris pointed to the image showing a child being grabbed by an adult, but then said it wasn't her daddy who did it. Dr. Reyes asked who it was, and Iris said she couldn't remember. Dr. Reyes said this kind of inconsistency was common in cases where children were being coached or were afraid to tell the truth. She recommended erring on the side of caution until more information could be gathered. I asked if I could see Iris now, and Dr. Reyes said she didn't think that was advisable given the circumstances. Lenora added that until they determined the source of the bruising, supervised visitation would be the safest option. I would be able to see Iris at a designated family visitation center for 2 hours on Saturday morning with a CPS observer present. The next 2 hours were a blur of paperwork and procedures. I had to sign forms acknowledging that Iris was being placed in my mother's care, that I understood the investigation was ongoing, that I would comply with all CPS requirements, including the supervised visitation. Officer Ramos took my contact information and said a detective from the child abuse unit would likely want to interview me further. Lenora said she'd be conducting home visits to my apartment and my mother's house to assess the living environments. She said I should expect someone to check in with my employer as well to verify my work schedule and behavior. The implication was clear that they were building a case and looking for any evidence that I was a danger to my child. They finally let me see Iris briefly before she left with my mother. She ran to me and wrapped her arms around my waist, asking why she had to go to Grandma's house on a school night. I knelt down and looked into her brown eyes, so much like Vanessa's, and told her it was just for a few days while some grown-up stuff got sorted out. She asked if she was in trouble, and I said no, absolutely not, that she hadn't done anything wrong. She asked if I was in trouble, and I couldn't answer honestly, so I just hugged her tight and told her I loved her more than anything in the world. My mother stood nearby, crying silently, and when Iris finally let go, my mother took her hand and led her toward the parking lot. Iris looked back at me twice before they disappeared around the corner, and both times I had to fight the urge to run after them and refuse to let her go. Officer Ramos watched the entire interaction like he was studying it for signs of manipulation or inappropriate behavior. I drove home in a daze and sat in my apartment for a long time, staring at Iris's backpack on the couch and her cereal bowl from breakfast still in the sink. The silence was oppressive without her presence. I called my sister Deanna, who lived 3 states away, and told her everything that had happened. She was furious on my behalf and said she'd get on a plane immediately to help, but I told her to wait until we knew more. She asked if I needed a lawyer, and I said I didn't know. Maybe. Probably. She said she'd research family law attorneys in my area and send me names. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand trying to decide who else to call. My friend Marcus from college, who was now a lawyer. My coworker Adrian, who had kids and might have advice. I ended up calling no one because I didn't know how to explain that people thought I was abusing my daughter when the accusation was so fundamentally wrong. It felt like reality had tilted sideways. I pulled up photos of Iris on my phone and scrolled through them looking for any pictures that showed her arms. In most photos, she was wearing long sleeves, but I found a few from a beach trip last month where she was in a tank top and there were no bruises visible. I screenshotted those photos thinking they might be useful as evidence of timeline. Then I started Googling information about CPS investigations and what happened when parents were falsely accused. The search results were terrifying. Story after story of families torn apart by system errors and children placed in foster care for months or years while parents fought to prove their innocence. Friday morning, I woke up to a call from Detective Laura Finch, who said she was investigating the case and needed me to come to the police station for a formal interview. I said I'd already answered questions, and Detective Finch said this was a follow-up that required recording and official documentation. I called in sick to work and drove to the station feeling like I was walking into a trap. Detective Finch was in her 50s with short gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. She led me to an interview room and activated a recording device before reading me my rights. The Miranda warning made everything feel surreal and criminal. She said I wasn't under arrest, but I was a person of interest in an ongoing investigation of child abuse. She showed me the photographs of Iris's bruises, and they were worse than I'd imagined. Clear dark marks on her pale skin, fingerprints visible in the discoloration. Detective Finch pointed out how the marks on the left arm showed 4 distinct points of contact consistent with fingers, while the right arm showed 5 points consistent with a thumb and 4 fingers. She said their forensic analyst had compared these marks to the photographs of my hands and found them to be a close match in size and span. I stared at the photos, feeling sick. Those were my daughter's arms with bruises that looked exactly like someone had grabbed her hard enough to hurt her, but I hadn't done it. I swore on everything I had that I hadn't done it. Detective Finch asked me to walk through the entire week again, minute by minute. I repeated everything I'd told Lenora and Officer Ramos, adding more details about specific meals we'd eaten and shows we'd watched and homework we'd completed. She asked if anyone could corroborate any of this, and I said no, because it had been just the 2 of us at home. She asked about my work schedule, and I explained that I typically worked 9 to 6 Monday through Friday, with occasional late meetings. She asked who watched Iris when I had late meetings, and I said my mother usually. She asked about last week specifically, and I had to check my calendar on my phone to confirm I'd worked late on Wednesday night, which meant my mother had picked Iris up from school and kept her until I got home around 8 p.m. Detective Finch made a note about Wednesday night and asked what condition Iris had been in when I picked her up. I said she'd seemed fine, maybe a little tired, had finished her homework at my mother's house. She'd been wearing a sweater because the weather had turned colder that week. Detective Finch asked if I'd noticed any bruises when Iris changed for bed that night, and I said I hadn't seen her arms because she'd worn pajamas with long sleeves. She asked if that was unusual, and I said no. She always wore long-sleeved pajamas unless it was summer. Detective Finch asked if my mother had mentioned anything unusual about Iris's behavior or appearance on Wednesday, and I said no. Everything had been routine. She asked for my mother's full name and contact information, which I provided. Then she asked about Maylene's family, and I gave her that information too. She said they'd be interviewing both my mother and the other family to see if anyone could shed light on when and how the bruises occurred. She asked if there was any possibility Iris had been grabbed or hurt at school, and I said I didn't think so, but I didn't know. The school was supposed to be safe. Teachers were supposed to protect kids. She said they were reviewing security footage and interviewing school staff to rule out that possibility. Then she asked a question that made my blood run cold. She asked if Iris had any behavioral problems or issues with lying. I said no, she was a good kid who generally told the truth. Detective Finch said that was interesting because during the forensic interview, Iris had given inconsistent answers about the bruises, first saying she didn't know how she got them, then pointing to a picture suggesting someone had grabbed her, then saying she couldn't remember who. That kind of inconsistency often indicated either trauma-blocking memory or a child who'd been coached to lie. She wanted to know if anyone had reason to coach Iris to make false accusations against me. The implication was clear that she thought maybe Vanessa's family blamed me for the car accident and was trying to use this situation to take Iris away from me. I told Detective Finch that Vanessa's parents had died years before we got married, and she'd been an only child with no extended family, besides some distant cousins we'd never met. There was no one who would do something like this. She asked if I had any enemies or anyone who might want to hurt me by hurting my daughter. I couldn't think of anyone. I got along fine with coworkers, didn't have any serious conflicts with neighbors or friends, had never been involved in anything that would generate that kind of malice. She asked about my financial situation and whether I was under any unusual stress. I admitted that money was tighter since Vanessa died because we'd gone from 2 incomes to 1, but I was managing. I hadn't missed any bills or fallen into debt. She asked if I'd considered that Iris might be acting out, because she missed her mother and wanted attention. I said Iris did miss Vanessa desperately, but she wasn't the kind of kid to hurt herself for attention. Detective Finch said that bruising might not have been self-inflicted, but could have been from rough play with friends that Iris was now afraid to admit to because she didn't want to get in trouble. I said that was possible, but it didn't explain why the bruises matched my hand size. She said hand sizes among adults weren't as unique as people thought, and that Iris could have been grabbed by anyone with hands roughly my dimensions. She said they were exploring all possibilities. The interview lasted 2 more hours with Detective Finch, circling back to the same questions from different angles, trying to catch me in inconsistencies or admissions. By the end, I was exhausted and terrified and no closer to understanding what had actually happened to my daughter. Saturday morning, I arrived at the Family Connections Visitation Center at 9 a.m. for my supervised 2-hour visit with Iris. The center was a converted house with playrooms and observation areas designed to allow parents to spend time with their children, while CPS workers watched and took notes. The supervisor assigned to us was a woman named Gloria who explained the rules. No closed doors, no whispering, no discussing the investigation or coaching Iris about what to say to authorities. Any violation would end the visit immediately. Iris was already in the playroom when I arrived, and she ran to me, just like she had at school. I held her for a long time before Gloria gently reminded us that we should use our time together productively. Iris asked why we had to meet in this strange place instead of at home, and I said it was just temporary while some grown-up problems got worked out. She asked if it was because of the marks on her arms, and I said we weren't supposed to talk about that right now. She looked confused and hurt, but accepted it. We spent the next 2 hours playing board games and drawing pictures and talking about school. Iris told me about a project she was doing on butterflies and asked if we could go to the science museum when she came home. I said of course we could do that soon. She asked when she could come home, and I said I hoped very soon that I was working on it. Gloria watched us from a chair in the corner writing notes periodically. I felt like every word I said and every gesture I made was being analyzed for signs of abuse or manipulation. When our 2 hours ended, Iris cried and didn't want to leave. Gloria had to firmly but kindly tell her it was time to go and that she'd see Daddy again soon. My mother picked Iris up and told me quietly that Iris had been having nightmares all week about being taken away forever. I told my mother to reassure her that wouldn't happen, even though I had no actual confidence that was true. Lenora Vance called Monday afternoon and asked if I could meet her at my apartment for a home inspection. I left work early and found her waiting outside with a clipboard and camera. She walked through every room, photographing and documenting details I never would have thought relevant. The cleanliness of the kitchen, the organization of Iris's bedroom, the presence of age-appropriate books and toys, the contents of my medicine cabinet, and the security of prescription bottles. She asked about my work schedule again and whether Iris was ever left unsupervised. I explained that Iris was at school during my work hours and that my mother or after-school care covered any gaps. Lenora made notes and took more photos. She asked to see where Iris slept, and I showed her the bedroom we'd carefully decorated together with butterfly wallpaper and a bookshelf full of stories. Lenora photographed everything, then asked if Iris ever slept in my bed. I said occasionally when she had nightmares about her mother, maybe once or twice a month. Lenora asked if that concerned me, and I said no. Grief counselors had told us that was normal and would gradually decrease as Iris processed her loss. Lenora made another note that felt more significant than it should have. She asked if I disciplined Iris, and I explained my approach of timeouts and natural consequences. She asked if I'd ever used physical punishment, and I said never. She asked if Vanessa had used physical punishment before she died, and I said no. We'd both agreed that wasn't how we wanted to parent. The inspection took an hour, and by the end, I felt violated and exposed. Like every private detail of my life was now evidence in a case against me. Detective Finch called Wednesday morning with news that made everything more complicated. They'd interviewed my mother, who confirmed picking up Iris from school on Wednesday and watching her until I picked her up that evening. My mother said Iris had been in good spirits, had done her homework without complaint, had helped make dinner. She said Iris had worn a cardigan sweater the entire time, and my mother hadn't seen her arms. More significantly, my mother had reported that when Iris was getting ready for bed that night, she'd helped her change into pajamas and hadn't noticed any bruises at that time. If the bruises had been present, they would have been visible when Iris removed her day clothes to put on pajamas. That meant the bruises had appeared sometime after Wednesday night. Detective Finch said this timeline was important because it narrowed the window for when the injury occurred. She asked what happened Thursday morning before school. I thought back and remembered that Thursday had been rushed because I'd overslept my alarm. I'd gotten Iris up quickly, made her toast for breakfast, told her to get dressed while I showered. She'd been wearing a jacket when we left for school because mornings were cold now. I'd dropped her off at 8:15 and gone straight to work. Detective Finch asked if Iris had seemed upset or different in any way Thursday morning. I said she'd been quiet, but I'd attributed that to being tired from the early wake-up. She asked if we'd had any conflict or argument that morning, and I said no. It had just been the normal rush to get out the door. She said the school nurse had examined Iris around 11 a.m. during the health screening, and the bruises had clearly been present then. That meant they'd appeared sometime between Wednesday night, when my mother helped her change, and Thursday morning when she arrived at school. Detective Finch asked if there was any possibility the bruises had been there Wednesday night, but were just too faint for my mother to notice. I said I didn't know, but my mother was pretty observant. She'd raised 4 kids and had seen plenty of bruises over the years. The investigation dragged on for another week. Detective Finch interviewed Mei Lin's parents, who confirmed Iris had been at their house for a playdate the previous Saturday, but had seemed fine and hadn't mentioned any injuries. They said the girls had played in Mei Lin's room and in the backyard, but it had all been supervised, and they hadn't witnessed any rough play or accidents. School security footage showed Iris arriving Thursday morning walking normally beside me, nothing that suggested she was in pain or distress. Teachers reported that Iris had participated in class activities normally that morning and hadn't complained about hurting. The school nurse who discovered the bruises said they'd been fresh, probably occurring within 12 to 24 hours before she examined them based on their color and lack of yellowing. Everything pointed to the bruises appearing Wednesday night or Thursday morning, during time when Iris had been solely in my care. Lenora called to say they were extending the protective custody because the investigation hadn't cleared me yet. Iris would remain with my mother for another week minimum. I asked when I'd get another supervised visit, and she said they were still determining an appropriate schedule. I said this was destroying my relationship with my daughter and teaching her that I was dangerous when I'd never hurt her. Lenora said she understood this was difficult, but child safety had to be the priority. The second supervised visit was worse than the first. Iris asked direct questions about whether I was in trouble and why she couldn't come home. The supervisor told her those were questions for her therapist, and we should focus on our time together. Iris became sullen and withdrawn, only perking up briefly when I told her stories about when she was a baby. When the visit ended, she asked if next time we could meet at our apartment instead of this weird place. I said I hoped so, and watched her leave with my mother feeling like I was losing pieces of her trust with every day that passed. My sister Deanna flew in the following week and attended a meeting with me, Lenora, and a CPS supervisor named Dennis Cho. Dennis laid out their concerns in clinical terms. The bruising was consistent with forceful grabbing by an adult. The timeline indicated the bruising occurred during time when I had sole custody. Iris's inconsistent statements during forensic interview raised concerns about either memory suppression due to trauma or fear of consequences if she told the truth. My lack of alibi or witnesses to corroborate my version of events meant they had only my word that I hadn't caused the injuries. The recommendation from their team was to move forward with a dependency hearing where a judge would determine whether Iris should be returned to my custody or remain in protective placement. Deanna erupted at this news, demanding to know what evidence they actually had beyond circumstantial coincidence. Dennis said the bruises themselves were evidence and that the burden of proof in dependency court was lower than criminal court. They only needed to show it was more likely than not that Iris was at risk in my care. I asked what I needed to do to prove I was safe. Dennis said completing a parenting assessment, attending therapy to address any stress or anger issues, and allowing ongoing CPS monitoring would all help my case. The implication that I had anger issues that needed therapy made me want to scream, but Deanna put her hand on my arm and told me to agree to everything. After the meeting, she said we needed a family law attorney immediately because this was heading toward permanent custody removal if we didn't fight back hard. She'd found a lawyer named Gabrielle Osman who specialized in defending parents in CPS cases. We met with Gabrielle that afternoon, and she reviewed all the documentation I'd been given. She said the case against me was weak, but that didn't always matter in dependency court where judges erred on the side of caution. We needed to find an alternative explanation for the bruises or prove they'd been fabricated somehow. She asked detailed questions about everyone in Iris's life, trying to identify other possible sources of injury. I mentioned every person I could think of, but none of them seemed likely. Gabrielle said she'd hire a private investigator to interview witnesses and review evidence the police might have missed. The dependency hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Iris remained with my mother, and I was granted 1 supervised visit per week. Gabrielle filed a motion demanding all evidence the state had collected, including photographs, medical reports, and interview transcripts. When we received the discovery packet, it contained new information that hadn't been shared before. The forensic analyst who'd compared my hand measurements to the bruises had noted that while the size was consistent, the spacing of the finger marks was slightly wider than my actual hand span. The difference was only a few millimeters, but it suggested the person who grabbed Iris had a hand shaped somewhat differently than mine. Gabrielle highlighted this detail and said it created reasonable doubt. She also found inconsistencies in the timeline. The school nurse had documented examining Iris at 11:13 a.m. on Thursday. She'd noted the bruises were dark purple with some blue discoloration, indicating they were relatively fresh. However, bruising typically takes several hours to develop and reach that level of discoloration. If the injury had occurred Thursday morning before school, the bruises likely wouldn't have been so pronounced by 11 a.m. That suggested the injury actually occurred Wednesday night, during the window when Iris was with my mother. Gabrielle said this was crucial, because my mother had stated she hadn't seen bruises when helping Iris change Wednesday night. Either my mother was lying or mistaken, or the injury happened after Iris was already in pajamas. Gabrielle asked if my mother ever grabbed Iris roughly during discipline. I said absolutely not. My mother was gentle and had never been physical with any of her grandchildren. But Gabrielle said we needed to explore every possibility no matter how uncomfortable. I confronted my mother at her house one evening after a supervised visit. I asked her directly to walk through Wednesday night again minute by minute. She repeated her story about picking Iris up from school, helping with homework, making dinner together, then helping Iris get ready for bed around 7:30 p.m. She said Iris had taken off her school clothes in the bathroom, put on pajamas, then came out to brush her teeth. My mother had helped her brush because Iris sometimes rushed and missed spots. Then Iris had gotten into the bed in the guest room, and my mother had read her a story before I arrived around 8 p.m. I asked if she was absolutely certain Iris hadn't had bruises when she changed clothes. My mother said she was certain because she would have noticed and asked about them. Then she paused, and her expression changed. She said actually now that she thought about it, Iris had kept her arms close to her body that night. almost hugging herself, which my mother had thought was because she was cold, but maybe it was because her arms hurt. I asked if anyone else had been at the house Wednesday evening. My mother said no, just her and Iris. But then she remembered that her neighbor Frank had stopped by briefly around 6:30 p.m. to return a borrowed ladder. He'd come to the back door, and my mother had invited him in for coffee. They'd chatted for maybe 15 minutes while Iris watched TV in the living room. My mother said Frank was harmless, a widower in his 70s who'd lived next door for 20 years. I asked if Frank had interacted with Iris at all. My mother thought for a moment, then said Frank had commented on how much Iris had grown and had patted her on the head when he left. Just a friendly gesture from an old man who'd known Iris since she was born. But something about this bothered me. I asked my mother for Frank's full name, and she said Frank Delaney. I asked if she'd mentioned Frank's visit to CPS or the police. She said no, it hadn't seemed relevant. I called Gabrielle immediately and told her about Frank Delaney. She said any adult who'd had contact with Iris during the critical timeline needed to be investigated. She'd have her private investigator look into Frank's background. 2 days later, Gabrielle called with information that made my stomach turn. Frank Delaney had a criminal record from 35 years ago. In 1988, he'd been charged with child endangerment after his own daughter had been found with bruises at school. The case had been dropped after his daughter recanted her statement saying she'd fallen downstairs. Frank's wife had divorced him shortly after and taken their daughter out of state. There'd been no further incidents on his record, but that one event was enough to raise serious questions. Gabrielle said we needed to tell CPS immediately, but that we also needed to be careful, because Frank was an elderly man, and accusing him without solid proof could backfire. I didn't care about being careful. If Frank had hurt Iris, I wanted him arrested. Gabrielle contacted Detective Finch and presented the new information. Detective Finch agreed to interview Frank, but cautioned that a 35-year-old charge that was dismissed wasn't strong evidence of current wrongdoing. She interviewed Frank 2 days later, and he claimed he'd stopped by my mother's house briefly, but had barely interacted with Iris beyond saying hello. He denied touching her beyond maybe a pat on the head in passing. He said he had arthritis in his hands and couldn't grip anything forcefully anymore. Detective Finch asked him to submit to having his hands photographed and measured. Frank agreed, and the measurements showed his hand span was actually slightly larger than mine. The forensic analyst reviewed the comparison and said Frank's hands were a closer match to the bruise spacing than mine had been. Suddenly, there was an alternative explanation that fit the physical evidence. The dependency hearing became a battle between two theories. The state argued I'd caused the bruises through rough handling and was lying about it. Gabrielle argued that Frank Delaney had grabbed Iris during his visit to my mother's house and that the timeline and forensic evidence supported this theory. The judge ordered a full forensic review of all physical evidence and postponed the hearing for another 2 weeks. During that time, Detective Finch obtained a warrant to search Frank's house. They found nothing that directly implicated him, but they did find a collection of old photographs showing children from the neighborhood, including several of Iris taken from a distance. Frank claimed he was just a lonely old man who enjoyed seeing kids play in the yards around his house, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But the photos were enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Gabrielle deposed my mother, who testified that she now remembered Frank had been standing very close to Iris when he patted her head, that he'd commented on her shirt and maybe touched her arm when he did so. My mother was crying when she admitted she'd thought nothing of it at the time, because Frank had always seemed like a harmless neighbor. She said if she'd known he had a history with his own child, she never would have let him near Iris. The judge ordered Frank to submit to a psychological evaluation and stay away from my mother's house and any contact with Iris. Lenora Vance visited me at work to say that based on new evidence, they were reassessing their recommendation about my custody. She said it appeared increasingly likely that the bruising hadn't been caused by me but by a third party during time when Iris was in my mother's care. She said, assuming the final forensic review confirmed this, they'd be moving to return Iris to my custody with CPS monitoring for 6 months. The final forensic report came back 3 weeks after the bruising was first discovered. The analyst concluded that the bruise pattern was more consistent with Frank Delaney's hand measurements than mine, and that the timeline better fit an incident occurring during his visit Wednesday evening rather than anything that happened Thursday morning. The report noted that Iris's inconsistent statements during the forensic interview could be explained by confusion about when and how she'd been grabbed, rather than by coaching or fear. Children often have difficulty with time sequencing, especially when asked to recall brief upsetting moments. The report recommended no criminal charges against me and return of custody with appropriate monitoring. Detective Finch interviewed Iris again with this new information and asked specifically about Mr. Frank from Grandma's neighborhood. Iris remembered him visiting while she was at Grandma's house. She said he'd talked to her and touched her arms when he said how much she'd grown. She said it had hurt a little, but she hadn't wanted to be rude, so she hadn't said anything. When Detective Finch showed Iris a photo of Frank, Iris confirmed that was the man from Grandma's house. Detective Finch asked why Iris hadn't mentioned this during the first interview. Iris said she hadn't understood that was what they were asking about. She thought they wanted to know if Daddy hurt her, and the answer was no, so that's what she'd said. The clarity of this explanation from Iris was devastating. a child unable to articulate that a neighbor had grabbed her too hard during what seemed like a friendly interaction, an investigation that assumed the most likely perpetrator was the parent with primary custody, a system that took weeks to identify an alternative explanation while traumatizing an entire family in the process. The judge issued an order returning Iris to my custody immediately, with a requirement that I participate in co-parenting counseling with my mother to improve communication and safety protocols. Frank Delaney was charged with child abuse and required to register as a child offender, pending trial. Iris came home on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks after the bruising had been discovered. She walked through the door of our apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, touching familiar objects and asking if this was really happening. I told her yes, she was home to stay, that we'd gotten everything figured out. She asked if the bad man from Grandma's neighborhood was why she had to leave. I said yes, and that he wouldn't be around anymore. She asked if I was mad at her for not explaining better about what happened. I knelt down and looked at her directly and said no, none of this was her fault, that she was a kid and shouldn't have had to explain anything. The adults should have listened better. We spent that first night home cooking her favorite dinner and watching movies and sleeping in our own beds. Iris had nightmares for weeks afterward, waking up scared that someone was going to take her away again. We started therapy together and separately to process what had happened. The therapist explained that the investigation had been traumatic, not just because of the separation, but because it had undermined Iris's sense of safety and trust in authority figures. She said rebuilding that would take time and patience. My relationship with my mother was strained for months. She blamed herself for letting Frank into her house, for not noticing when he grabbed Iris, for not protecting her granddaughter. I told her it wasn't her fault either, but the guilt ate at her. She became hypervigilant about anyone who came near Iris and started screening all the neighbors in her building. Frank Delaney's trial happened 8 months later. He pleaded guilty to child abuse in exchange for a suspended sentence and mandatory registration. The plea deal felt inadequate given what his actions had cost my family, but the prosecutor said proving intent beyond reasonable doubt would have been difficult. At least he was now on record as a danger to children. Iris testified briefly about what she remembered, and Frank apologized to her in court, though his apology felt hollow and self-serving. Gabrielle helped me file a civil suit against Frank for damages, and we settled for an amount that would cover Iris's therapy for years. The money didn't undo the trauma, but it at least ensured she'd have the support she needed. 2 years later, Iris is 10 and thriving despite everything. She's cautious around new people now and asks more questions about who's safe and who isn't. She knows that a neighbor hurt her and that everyone thought it was me at first, because the grown-ups made mistakes. She knows the truth won out eventually, but that the process was scary and unfair. She's learned earlier than most kids that systems meant to protect can also cause harm, that accusations can shatter lives even when they're wrong, and that sometimes the people who should be safe turn out to be dangerous. The bruises faded from her arms months ago, but the experience left different kinds of marks that will take longer to heal. We're working on it together, day by day, and rebuilding trust in a world that broke it so completely. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So, subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.